The argument from the fact of existence is probably something not a lot of you have thought about before. I certainly hadn't until I came across it sometime a few months ago. The version I encountered is credited to Anton Thorn. I haven't been able to access the original essay Thorn wrote, but I found an outline of it on an atheist's blog. The link is in the video's description. And I found it interesting, so I thought I'd explain it in a video and see what people think. If successful, the argument disproves the possibility of there existing a creator God. Specifically, it shows that a conscious being cannot be the source of existence. In other words, it means that atheist Gnostics are correct. Before I go into detail with the argument, I think it will be helpful to explain that term, atheist Gnostics. The difference between atheism and theism is easy enough. Theism is the belief that at least one deity exists. Atheism is the negation of that. There is no middle ground, despite what many people who claim to be agnostic will tell you. You either have a theistic belief or you don't. Gnosticism is a belief about what is knowable, not what exists. Gnostics believe that whether or not deities exist is knowable. Agnostics believe the opposite of that divine existence is unknowable. The two most common combinations of these terms are atheist agnostics and theist Gnostics. Atheist agnostics believe that the existence of a certain deity is unknowable, and so they suspend belief about that deity. As a result, they lack a theistic belief and are called atheists. Theistic Gnostics believe that it is both knowable and true that a certain God exists. Most people with God belief fall into this category, but not all. It is possible to be a Gnostic theist, someone who doesn't think it's knowable whether or not God exists, but believes in God anyways. Immanuel Kant is a notable example of someone who holds this position. Lastly, we have atheist Gnostics. This position posits that it is knowable that a certain deity doesn't exist. And this is the position that the argument from the fact of existence supports. If it is sound, then we should all be atheist Gnostics about any deity that is claimed to be the creator. To understand the argument, you first have to understand two philosophical terms it uses. These terms are 1. The metaphysical primacy of existence, and 2. The metaphysical primacy of consciousness. Metaphysical just means that the terms deal with the fundamental nature of being, or reality. Primacy, according to Merriam-Webster's, means the state of being first or foremost. Or, in other words, it means dominance or is prime. In our context, if we say that one thing holds primacy over another, we mean that the first precedes the second, and thus is necessary for the second to exist. What that means for these terms is that if existence holds metaphysical primacy over consciousness, existence must exist for consciousness to exist. On the other hand, if consciousness holds metaphysical primacy over existence, then consciousness must exist for existence to exist. And these are exhaustive possibilities. It's either true that existence holds primacy or consciousness does. The two are also mutually exclusive. It can't be that existence holds primacy over consciousness and consciousness holds primacy over existence. But that doesn't really say anything about what the terms actually mean. Here's a stab at an explanation. If the metaphysical primacy of existence is valid, or true, then that means that existence exists separate from consciousness. This means that existence and consciousness are metaphysically distinct things, and that the existence of consciousness relies on existence itself to exist. On this view, the role of consciousness is to passively perceive what exists, not to alter it. On the other hand, if metaphysical primacy of consciousness is valid, then existence is an object of consciousness, as in, nothing outside of consciousness exists. Existence relies on consciousness to exist. The role of consciousness in this view is thus much larger. Consciousness alters and controls existence rather than playing a passive perceptive role. Okay, now that we've got our terms, here's the argument in succinct form. First premise: if a creator God exists, then the primacy of consciousness is valid. Second premise: the primacy of consciousness is not valid. Conclusion: thus, a creator God cannot exist. The first premise is pretty easily shown to be true. If a God exists, is a conscious being, and created the universe, then existence came from consciousness. If existence came from consciousness, it relies on the consciousness for existence. Thus, consciousness holds metaphysical primacy over existence. So, for that God to exist, the primacy of consciousness must be valid. The second premise, however, disputes that claim, and the reasoning behind this premise is as follows. 1. Existence exists. 2. If existence exists, existence holds metaphysical primacy. 3. If existence holds metaphysical primacy, the metaphysical primacy of consciousness is invalid. 4. Therefore, the metaphysical primacy of consciousness is invalid. To see why number 2 is true, think about the opposite being true. Existence existing and not holding metaphysical primacy. That would mean that consciousness holds metaphysical primacy, and so existence depends on consciousness. For existence to exist, then, consciousness must exist. But if consciousness exists, then it must be the case that something exists. If something exists, then existence exists. So we see that consciousness can only exist if existence exists, and thus existence holds metaphysical primacy over consciousness. It cannot be that consciousness exists without existence existing, and so it cannot be the case that consciousness holds metaphysical primacy over existence. So the argument in a nutshell is this. It is impossible for consciousness to exist without existence existing, so it is impossible for existence to come from consciousness. Therefore, it is impossible for a creator God to exist. I've thought about possible objections to this argument a lot, but with very limited success. The only place in the argument I can see that is open to refutation is the second premise, whether or not consciousness holds metaphysical primacy. The first premise is true by definition of the term creator God, and the conclusion very clearly follows from the premises. So, if the argument is unsound, the second premise must be wrong. The best attempt I've come up with at showing the second premise is wrong is by applying a philosophy called idealism to the picture. Idealism is essentially the opposite of materialism. It is the claim that material objects do not exist separate from the mind. Sound familiar? It should. It's a very close cousin to primacy of consciousness metaphysics. The objection goes like this. If idealism is correct, then nothing except consciousness exists. This means that existence in a weak sense relies on consciousness. If consciousness didn't exist, then existence wouldn't exist, since there's nothing else that exists. So it's not the case that existence exists independently of consciousness, and so it can be said that the primacy of consciousness is valid. But I don't think this objection is successful. Essentially what it is saying is that existence and consciousness are mutually prime, that one cannot exist without the other. But this isn't correct. It is possible that existence exists and consciousness not exist. It is not possible that consciousness exists and yet existence not exist. Thus, in a strong sense, consciousness relies on existence, but only in a weak sense does existence rely on consciousness for its existence. I think it is betraying the word primacy to say that the strong sense in which existence is prime does not outweigh the weak sense in which consciousness is, and so it is a contradiction of terms to say that existence and consciousness are mutually prime. And even if the objection is successful, the orthodox view of God creating the universe is still wrong. The only way to accurately believe in a creator God would be to believe that God created only other conscious beings, but did not create actual physical objects. Instead, he created only our perceptions of those physical objects. So, if the objection is successful, then theists should all adopt a view akin to Leibniz's monadology, which claims that the only things that exist as things in themselves are an uncountable number of tiny, conscious metaphysical objects called monads that send representations to other conscious beings, which are experienced as perceptions, without actually interacting with each other, but by changing the nature of the representations in a pre-established harmony that was set up by God at the moment of creation. Yeah, I personally don't think that's a victory for the theist, but then again, many famous philosophers have been idealists, and don't seem to think it's all that crazy. But it doesn't really matter what German geniuses hundreds of years ago thought. What really matters is what is true. What other people think is true does not impact whether a proposition is actually true. Just because billions of people on this planet believe in a creator God does not mean that this argument must be unsuccessful. If we're going to be honest with ourselves, the only way to go about believing something is by thinking it through ourselves. So, I encourage anyone who watches this to seriously think about this argument and not just dismiss it as high-minded nonsense that doesn't actually apply to the real world. All this argument is logic, and if logic doesn't apply to the real world, then I'm not sure what does. When I personally think it through, my intuition tells me there's something wrong with the argument. I very strongly have the intuition of an atheist agnostic. But the thing is, I can't find anything wrong with the argument. If any of you can, I very much welcome your thoughts. And even if you can't, I'm very interested in your reaction, so leave a comment or a video response and tell me what you think.